The knife slipped, and blood bloomed across the kitchen towel before I even registered the pain, because grief does that to you. It steals your attention from your own body and gives it to a hole in your chest that never seems to close. That morning I had woken up to the sound of silence where my husband's snoring used to be, and I had baked a pie out of desperation, not joy, because I did not know what else to do with my hands. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in the quiet magic of a stranger's small gesture changing everything, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a reminder that hope still exists, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so you never miss a story like this one. My name is Margaret, and I was 63 years old the year my husband Walter died of a heart attack in the garden he loved more than almost anything except me. The house felt enormous after that, every room echoing with a silence so loud it had a texture, like static pressed against my skin. My children called every Sunday, dutiful and loving, but they lived states away with their own lives, their own children, their own storms to weather. I was left with an empty house, a garden gone to weeds because I could not bear to touch Walter's tomato plants, and an ache that woke me at 3 in the morning more nights than not. It was in that fog of grief that I noticed him, really noticed him, for the first time. Harold lived 2 houses down, a widower himself, though his wife Ruth had passed nearly 3 years before Walter did. I had seen him at the mailbox, at the edge of his lawn, always alone, always moving a little slower than the seasons before. We had exchanged polite nods for years, the kind of neighborly acknowledgement that costs nothing and means little, but something shifted in me one Tuesday afternoon when I watched him sit on his porch steps for nearly 20 minutes without moving, just staring at nothing, the way I stared at nothing most days myself. I do not know what made me pick up that rolling pin the next morning. Maybe it was recognition, the way you can spot your own loneliness reflected in someone else's shoulders. Maybe it was that baking had always been how I loved people, how I said the things words could not carry. Walter used to say my apple pie could mend a broken heart, and though I had laughed it off as sentimental nonsense, standing in my kitchen that morning with flour on my hands and tears I refused to acknowledge running down my face, I decided to test his theory on someone other than myself. The pie took most of the afternoon, and I poured into it everything I could not say out loud, the loneliness, the fear of growing old without a partner, the strange guilt of still being alive when the person you built your world around was gone. When it finally cooled on the counter, golden and fragrant with cinnamon, I wrapped it carefully, walked the 2 houses down, and knocked before I could talk myself out of it. Harold opened the door looking startled, as though visitors were a foreign concept in his world, and when I held out that pie and mumbled something about having baked too much, his eyes filled with a wetness he tried to blink away, and he said thank you in a voice so raw it broke something open in my chest. He invited me in, almost shyly, and we sat at his kitchen table, the one Ruth had chosen, he told me, from an estate sale 30 years earlier, and we talked. We talked about nothing important that first afternoon, the weather, the price of gasoline, a leak in his roof he kept meaning to fix, but underneath the small talk ran a current of understanding that only 2 people carrying the same invisible weight could share. I found myself laughing for the first time in months, a real laugh, surprising myself with the sound of it. Before I left, he walked me to the door and said, almost too quietly for me to hear, that it had been the best afternoon he'd had since Ruth passed. That pie became a habit, then a ritual, then something neither of us dared to name. Every week I would bake, sometimes apple, sometimes peach, once a disastrous attempt at key lime that we both agreed to never speak of again, and every week Harold would answer the door with a little more light in his eyes than the week before. We began sharing dinners, then Sunday mornings on his porch with coffee, watching the birds fight over his feeder, then evening walks around the block that stretched longer and longer as the weeks turned into months. I found myself dressing a little more carefully on the days I knew I would see him, catching myself smiling at nothing while I did the dishes, feeling something unfamiliar and terrifying and wonderful stirring back to life inside a heart I had assumed was permanently shuttered. It was not without its struggles. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, racked with a guilt that felt like betrayal, as though finding comfort in another man's company somehow diminished the 38 years I had spent loving Walter. Harold confessed one evening, his voice thick with emotion, that he felt the same, that some mornings he could not look at Ruth's photograph on the mantel without feeling like he was doing something wrong simply by feeling happy again. We sat with that confession together, 2 people terrified of moving forward and terrified of standing still, and somehow the sharing of it made the weight lighter for both of us. My daughter, when I finally worked up the courage to tell her about my new friend, was quiet for a long moment before telling me that her father would want nothing more than for me to laugh again, that love does not get used up, it only makes more room for itself. One Sunday in late autumn, the kind of golden afternoon where the light slants just right through changing leaves, I brought over a pumpkin pie still warm from the oven, and Harold met me at the door with a grin that seemed to erase 20 years from his face. He took the pie, set it on the table, and before I could even settle into my usual chair, he took my hand in his weathered one and said, with a twinkle I will never forget, that if we were 20 years younger, he would marry me on the spot, pie and all. I laughed so hard I nearly cried, and then I did cry, but they were not sad tears, they were the tears of someone who thought her capacity for joy had died along with her husband and was discovering, slowly and miraculously, that it had only been sleeping. We did not marry, not in any legal sense, because at our age we both agreed the paperwork mattered less than the presence, but we became something to each other that neither of us had words for beyond simply calling it love. We spent the following spring replanting Walter's garden together, Harold insisting the tomatoes deserved a second chance just as much as we did, and some evenings, sitting on the porch with his hand in mine and the smell of pie still lingering in the kitchen, I would think about how close I came to staying locked inside that silent house, and I would offer up a quiet, grateful prayer to whatever force had pushed me to pick up that rolling pin on a Tuesday morning when I had nothing left to give but flour and grief and hope. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so we can keep bringing you stories like Margaret and Harold's. And before you go, I have a special request, please comment the word, pie, below if you believe love can find us again at any age, no matter how old, no matter how broken our hearts once were. Because sometimes the smallest gesture, a warm pie carried 2 doors down on a lonely afternoon, is all it takes to remind 2 grieving hearts that they still have room left to love, and that it is never, ever too late to begin again.